Um, Thank you for being here today on such a uh, gorgeous day outside. Ooh, a little loud. Oh, it's good? Okay. My name is Ariel Weininger. I'm the Chief Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And on behalf of the museum's leadership, survivors, staff, and volunteers, I thank you for joining us today for the opening program of Kindertransport, Rescuing Children on the Brink of War. Through personal artifacts and survivor testimony, the exhibition looks at individual experiences of some of the 10,000 rescued children from Nazi Europe who found haven in the United Kingdom. I want to recognize the kinder we have here today, Ernie Hyman. And I know that there are also some kinder families, kinder associated families, so let's recognize them too. The exhibition was made possible by the generous support of the Abe and Ida Cooper Foundation, the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Women's Leadership Committee. Additional support was provided by the Rubens Family Foundation, the Florence and Lawrence Spungen Family Foundation, and I should recognize that Danny Spungen is here and is also a lender to the exhibition. The Golder Family Foundation and Mark and Lisa Pinsky. Today, we are honored to have with us Ilona Moradof, Curator of Kindertransport and Associate Director of Administration and Special Projects at Yeshiva University Museum. Melissa Hacker, Executive Director of the Kindertransport Association and second-generation descendant of Kindertransport survivor Ruth Morley née Birnholz, and Director of the documentary film My Knees Were Jumping, Remembering the Kindertransports. And Dr. Phyllis Lassner, Professor Emerita in the Crown Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University and a member of the museum's Collection and Exhibitions Committee. At the conclusion of the program, we will have time for a short Q&A. To begin, I welcome to the stage His Majesty's Consul General for Chicago, Alan Gogbashian. Consul General.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Good afternoon, everybody. As Ariel said, I'm Alan Gogbashian. I'm the British Consul General to the Midwest, based here in Chicago. We oversee the UK's relationship with 14 states across the region. And it's my absolute honor today to be here with you to mark the opening of this really remarkable exhibition. I was in London in 2018 when the Jewish Museum there had a really remarkable event, an exhibition marking the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht and celebrating the Kindertransport legacy. And it's really special to see something happening here in the same area. I too want to pay my deepest respect and honor to Ernie Hyman, who's here with his wife Roz, and to all the Kinder families here. I had the privilege of speaking with Mr. Hyman just before, and to hear his story, how he was brought from Germany to school in the British city of Northampton was quite moving, and his story is there in the exhibition as well. The Kindertransport efforts to rescue Jewish children from across Nazi-occupied Europe before the outbreak of World War II were unlike any undertaken in history. And in the United Kingdom, we're privileged to have played a part working together between the British government with the British refugee aid organizations in the UK with other partners across Europe and in Germany to organize the largest of the Kindertransport program, which ultimately saved the lives of nearly 10,000, mainly Jewish children, and gave them safe passage to new lives in Britain. And the effort really was a beacon of hope during one of humanity's darkest periods. Today in the UK, we all learn about Kindertransport in schools. My children have learned about Kindertransport. You'll see public monuments that stand as reminders of the bravery and solidarity of the people who work together to rescue the children. The memorial at the port of Harwich marks the spot where many of the children arrived, and another is at Liverpool Street Station in London, commemorating another significant point of arrival. Many remained in the UK, became British citizens. Other kinder, like Mr. Hyman, emigrated to the US, Canada, Australia. The vast majority, of course, heartbreakingly never saw their parents again. And memorials in Harwich and in London commemorate not just the children, but the parents and the incredibly difficult decision they had to make in saying goodbye to their children. Like those monuments, this exhibition provides a crucial space for us to reflect on the Kindertransport legacy and remember the values of compassion and tolerance that define it. In the UK, we will continue to teach our children of this history. The King himself, King Charles III, attaches huge importance to the Kindertransport legacy, and he made that clear when he took over from Queen Elizabeth II as patron of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. So thank you so much again for this opportunity to share this opening with you. Thank you to our friends at the Illinois Holocaust Museum for creating such a special exhibit. And it's now my privilege to welcome the panel members to the stage for the discussion that's going to follow. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me? My name is Ilona Moradof. I'm Associate Director of Administration and Special Projects at Yeshiva University Museum in New York, and I served as the curator for the exhibition. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and with my fellow panelists. I'm going to talk just a little bit about how the exhibition came together and then show you a few objects that are related to the Kindertransport. So the Kindertransport is German for children's transport. And as we have heard, it describes the effort that brought close to 10,000 children from Nazi Europe to Great Britain. There were other Kindertransports. There were Kindertransports that went to Belgium, to France, to the Netherlands, to Sweden, and to Switzerland, but on a much smaller scale. And the exhibition really focuses on the experience of children who went to Great Britain. We refer to the children who participated in the Kindertransport program as Kinder or Kind. So you'll hear us use these words. How did the exhibition come together? The exhibition was conceived as a collaboration between Yeshiva University Museum and the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. The original exhibition opened in 2018 to mark the 80th anniversary of the first Kindertransport. The first Kindertransport took place on December 1st, 1938, just a few weeks after the pogroms in November that we know as Kristallnacht. So the Consul General was just referring to the exhibition in London. Up to 2018, there had not yet been a first major exhibition in America on the Kindertransport that told the story thematically. So we worked with Kinder and their families. We did research in archival and museum collections, and everybody shared generously their stories and the objects, and we recorded new audio recordings for the exhibition. And our approach was really to tell the story of the Kindertransport through the voices of the children, of the parents, of the people involved in the Kindertransport, like social workers. We tried to minimize the curatorial voice in the exhibition, and you will see that when you go to see it. We are thrilled that the exhibition is now in Skokie, and you are actually seeing an expanded version. So it's a bigger version than the original exhibition because our wonderful colleagues here in Skokie have added testimonies and stories and objects, including stories of Kinder who settled in the Chicago area. I too am very glad to have met Ernie, and thank you for being here, and his story is featured in the exhibition as well. Let's look at a few visuals. Okay, we're seeing here a few photographs of some of the kinder who were featured in the exhibition, and we see them with their parents, with a sibling, with their grandparents. And shortly after these photos were taken, the parents made the decision to send their children on a Kindertransport. Now, I say parents, but that wasn't always true, especially in the immediate aftermath of Kristallnacht. It really had very often to be the mother who made the decision because the fathers had been arrested during Kristallnacht and were imprisoned in concentration camps. So the decision to send one's child away on a transport to a foreign country, far away from the parents, from the families, from the friends, from the hometowns, from the language that one is familiar with, was a very difficult one, and not every parent was able to make that decision. The objects in the exhibition, many of the objects, illustrate the sacrifice that many of the parents made by sending their child away. Many of the kinder noted later that they were not aware at the time of the sacrifice their parents had made. It only occurred to them later. Parents did not know if they were ever able to reunite. Let's look at some of these objects. And for those of you who have been in the exhibition, you'll recognize some of them. So we're seeing here objects from Eva Goldman. Eva Goldman was from the German city of Wuppertal, Barmen, and you can see the name also on that box of bandages because it was bought by her parents before she left. She had a sheltered upbringing, and when the Nazis came to power, everything changed, and Kristallnacht made it even worse. So the father was incarcerated in a Dachau concentration camp. Eva was no longer able to attend public school. The parents were eventually deprived of all their assets. She was an only child, but the parents made the decision to send 15-year-old Eva on a Kindertransport. And so the mother sewed on her name tags, and you see a name tag enlarged, to her clothing. And the pocket dictionary, English, German, was added, and this box of bandages. And the daughter found a whole trunk of things that the parents had packed. The parents made it to the Netherlands, but were overruled by the Nazis there, and they did not survive the Nazi terror. So, in addition to practical items, parents also packed items that could provide comfort during difficult times. Items that would remind the children of their families, of their religious identity. And so we're seeing here on the left Mainz photo cards. And I mentioned to Ernie Hyman, who is also from Mainz, that we have another kind in the exhibition from Mainz. So these cards actually belonged to Elsbeth Gärtner from Mainz. And so these cards were to remind her of her hometown. Also packed into her trunk was a prayer book with a dedication of her grandmother who did not survive the war. Elsbeth was actually able to reunite with her parents after the war. On the right, we see a necklace with a Star of David that was sewn into the lining of a coat worn by Ruth Birnholz from Vienna. And we'll talk about Ruth Birnholz a little later. Whoops, sorry, too far. So the sacrifice and self-affirming, life-affirming, not self-affirming, life-affirming attitude of the parents is also shown in these artifacts. On the left, we see the dress of Grete Hirsch. Grete Hirsch was already 17 when she went on a Kindertransport. Her mother, Martha, was making this dress days before her daughter left. And the family remembers that she was crying the whole time while she was making the dress. Her daughter was a talented violin student, and it is thought that she made this dress in case there would be an opportunity for Grete to perform. As an aside, and we're not saying this in the exhibition, Grete Hirsch was the daughter of Otto Hirsch, one of the leaders of German Jewry. And he represented German Jews to the Nazi authorities, and he was an early supporter of the Kindertransport. And the parents were able to get their 3 children out, but both were victims of the Nazi terror. Some parents did not know if and when they were able, they would be able to see their children. Of course, that was true for most of them, unless they already knew that papers were coming. And so they provided marriage trousseau items for their young daughters. And so on the right, we see a monogrammed towel and tablecloth that also belonged to Elsbeth Gärtner from Mainz, the girl we had just seen her photo cards of in the previous slide. Okay, so while Great Britain did not require visas for these children, they put strict conditions upon the admission of these children. So these children had to be, it had to be clear that these children would not become a financial burden on British society. So the goal was really to find guarantors and to find people who would have the funds to help with the whole operation. But not every child was a so-called guaranteed child. Some people had family and friends and colleagues in Britain, and they were able to find guarantors and host families for their children, but others did not. And what you're seeing here are personal ads that people put into the Jewish Chronicle in November and December 1938. So shortly after Kristallnacht, just to read the first one, a mother begs good-hearted people to get a permit for two charming girls, 11 and 17 years of age, father in Dachau, apply Vienna. So just another case where the mother had to make that tough decision on her own because the father was still in a concentration camp. This is the map that you will also see on the floor in the exhibition. The children were really coming from all over Germany and its annexed territories. Most of the children left on a train for the Netherlands, and from there they went by ship to Harwich or Southampton. Some, upon arrival, were welcomed by their foster or host families. Others lived in hostels, in schools, on farms. The early unguaranteed transports with children who did not have anybody, they were first brought to holiday camps. And then it was attempted to find families for them. The children were distributed. They lived in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. The experiences of the children varied. Some had people who cared for them, who took interest in them, and others were mistreated and abused, unfortunately. And so we have two quotes here from recordings that we did for the exhibition from two different kinder. Ursula Levin-Strauss remembers the following. The people with whom I lived were exceptional in every way. They treated me like their daughter, sent me to the school their daughter had gone to, and later on, when I learned English and so on, introduced me as their daughter when I obviously wasn't. She was staying with a family that belonged to Church of England. They were Quakers, and the Quakers were actually very, very involved in the Kindertransport effort. Ilse Hönigsberg-Melamed was not as lucky. She remembered, my new guardians wanted to transform me into a child that they never had. They weren't very ready to accept me as I was, or that's how I felt. My guardians were glad to be rid of me at the first opportunity, which came when I was 14, which was the official school leaving age. So the way that these families stayed in touch, the parents in Nazi Europe and their children in Great Britain, was by writing letters and later through notes through the Red Cross. Of course, this was before there was email and WhatsApp and all of that. It was not easy. And what we see in many of the letters is how the parents tried to parent from afar, giving advice on how to be a better student, to please behave to the foster families, and trying to console their child when the children were sad. Many of the parents tried not to show their difficult situation in their letters, but the older children knew that their parents were in a difficult situation. And so In this case, this is a letter from Eva Goldman, and she writes to her host family. She didn't have a permanent family she stayed with, but she was a family invited her to go to holidays to the seaside or to spend weekends with them, and she was very close to the Grigsby family. Even to this generation, the descendants name children after the ancestors in the other family, so they grew very close even in the following generations. And so she writes to this host family, "Today I have my free day and I'm longing to write to you and to tell you all my troubles and sorrows, as I can't write anything to my parents because I don't want to worry them. Of course, they don't know that I'm kitchen mate and so on." Well, to be a kitchen maid was not her parents' dream. She went to high school. They probably expected that she gets more of an education, but that was the reality that this kind lived in. Getting to the end. So some parents hoped that their child might help them to get out of Nazi Europe. And some of the kinder were actually able to help their parents. They were able to secure sponsors that helped their parents get out. This letter is a letter from Alfred Katscher in Vienna to his son Heinz Ludwig. It's from a collection at the Leo Baeck Institute that holds 331 letters from this family. Most were very loving letters, very affectionate letters, very personal letters from the parents. And even the first letter that you can see in the exhibition, this one is not in the exhibition. The first letter is actually from the wife, Leopoldine Katscher. Even there, you can see how much the family hoped that their kind would be a way out of Germany. So this is from the father to the son. "Bubi, it pains me to tell you that you're really the only one in a position to help us. If the voyage to Cuba, the last possibility for us, does not pan out, I'm afraid that we shall never see one another again. It is really serious here, and neither Mutti nor I can hold out for much longer under these circumstances. Again, Bubi, you represent our last hope." The parents were unfortunately not able to get out. They were deported east and murdered by the Nazis. The majority of the children had to find out after the war that their parents had not survived, or a parent had not survived. And sometimes the last letters were the last sign of life. This is a letter from Gisela Reich in Vienna to her son Alfred Bader in Canada in 1942. So Alfred actually went on, I believe, the second Kindertransport of unguaranteed children, which means he did not have a place to come to also. And he was in a holiday camp, and they were shuttled around until homes for the families were found. In 1940, he was interned as an enemy alien. And he was first interned in an internment camp because he was from Nazi territory. And so this happened to about 1,000 of the kinder. They were interned in internment camps. And so there is a quote in the exhibition, which I think is really strong and represents the feelings of many of those kinder, that says something along the lines of, "In Germany, we were persecuted as Jews, and in England, we were interned as Germans." And so he was first interned on the Isle of Man and was then shipped off to Canada. And so this is why this letter reaches him in Canada. And this is the last letter from the mother 9 days before she was deported to Theresienstadt. And she was murdered in November of that same year. "My beloved, dear only child, day and night my thoughts and worries are with you, my everything. I beg you, be careful with your health and life. Do not do anything dangerous. I beg you, my all. Always be careful when swimming. Do not swim under the water. Do not stay in the water for too long. Take care not to get sunburned or a sunstroke. My beloved Bobby, my good Alfred child, there are so many, many worries about a beloved child so distant. My beloved child, may God guard you and protect you in all your ways and give you Eliyahu Hanavi as a guardian." But there were children that were reunited with their families, or some of their families. And but even for those, it wasn't always a joyful reunion because the families had been apart for so long, and they had gone through very different experiences. But I want to end this with a photograph of a family that was reunited. We're seeing here Ruth Birnholz with her parents Alice and Marco Birnholz in Brooklyn in 1943. And if you're looking at the grandmother, I was saying this to Melissa earlier today, you can see some resemblances to Melissa because the photograph shows her mother and her grandparents. And I think this is a perfect moment to let Melissa continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilona. I am also delighted and honored to be here. I am, as Ariane noted, I'm here a bit wearing three hats or from three perspectives. One is as the daughter of a Kindertransport survivor there from Vienna who traveled on the train with the Jewish star necklace sewn into her coat. Another is as the executive director of the Kindertransport Association, which is a nonprofit founded by Kindertransport survivors 30 years ago with the missions to connect Kinder and the next generations and to be involved in Holocaust education, including the story of the Kindertransports as an important story of the Holocaust, and to support and advocate for children at risk today, especially refugees without parents. This is a little, you can all hear me, right? Yes, okay. So this was founded, the KTA, as a multi-generational group, which was unusual at the time and still is, in that it isn't just a survivor organization or just a second generation organization, but is end. And for those of you who are in survivor families, you might be able to imagine that this has caused a bit of friction or misunderstandings at times, but we have really all sort of muddled through and tried to understand and support each other across the generations. And I think it's one of the things that really gives the Kindertransport Association the longevity that it has from the beginning included all the generations. And it's in this role that I've just gotten back, really. I just arrived here yesterday from a trip to London, a 5-day trip for the 85th anniversary of the Kindertransports, where I was with 42 Kindertransport generations. The eldest was 92 years old, a kind Ralph Samuel from Dresden, and the youngest was Alia, a 6-month-old baby of the 4th generation. And we visited the memorials that the Consul General spoke of. There are actually 2 memorials in Liverpool Street Station, one upstairs and by Frank Meisler, who has made Kindertransport memorials in many of the train stations. There's one in Danzig. There's one at Hook of Holland. There's one in Berlin. In Berlin, it's very interesting because the Kindertransport Memorial statue there is twofold. On one side, it's called Trains to Life, and the other side, Trains to Death, which on one side, it shows Kindertransport children going west, and on the other, it shows children going east to concentration camps. We always, when we speak of the Kindertransports, must remember the parents who put them on those trains and the children's siblings, cousins, school friends who were also murdered. And so I want to just say, if I forget words or anything today, please forgive me because it is the jet lag. Seriously. So the third hat I wear is as a filmmaker. And I directed the first documentary film made on the Kindertransports. My knees were jumping, remembering the Kindertransports. So I want to talk a little bit about growing up with this mother. And it's my mother and grandmother both, and I have the same eyebrows and the same nose. So I grew up in New York City with a mother who was afraid. She was afraid of crowds, of people in uniform, of the fragility and uncertainty of the world. This was unspoken, but really, for as long as I can remember, I had developed a second set of eyes and ears to look out for dangers that she would face. I was constantly on the alert to threats to her tenuous sense of security. So my mother grew up in Vienna and fled by Kindertransport in January 1939. Growing up in New York, I didn't know any Holocaust survivor families. I have to add a caveat to that I did, but nobody talked about it. So I didn't know that I knew them. And I didn't know I was part of a survivor family myself. I knew that my mother was not like other American mothers. She had an accent. She and her mother spoke to each other in German, a language that she very specifically did not want my sister and I to learn. And I felt that she had been through so much more as a child than I could possibly understand and that I needed to protect her. But from what, I didn't know. And I knew I couldn't ask. I don't know. I have a very strong memory when I was around 13, while Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust, was excerpted in the Sunday New York Times magazine. And, mostly I read the Sunday New York Times to look for the Ninas in the Al Hirschfeld drawings in the arts and leisure section. But this time I saw the magazine and I saw that article. I remember running across my apartment to my mother's bedroom, carrying the magazine and saying, look, there are other families like ours. So my mother shared fragments of her life as a Jewish child in Vienna when I was very young. And I can't remember not knowing that something was different, but I could never connect these isolated bits and pieces to a linear story. What happened? Who was there? When did it happen? How? And I later learned my mother couldn't either. That was part of, what trauma as a child does to memory. My mother wanted me to know what had happened. Why? So that I would be prepared when it happened again. Her parents, like so many others, did not believe that what was happening in Germany would ever happen in Austria. And after the Anschluss, they tried to leave as a family. But my mother's father, Marco, was born in the Bukovina. And when he was born there, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he was an Austrian citizen. But after World War I, it was named where he was from was Poland. So he was given Polish citizenship. So my mother and her mother were on the Austrian quota to the United States. And my grandfather was on the Polish quota, and his number was not coming up. And my grandmother refused to leave without her husband. So they put my mother, a child, 12-year-old who had never crossed the street alone before, on a train carrying refugee children to England. I didn't know, and she didn't know, that she was one of thousands of children who had been sent to the United Kingdom. I only learned this when I was an undergraduate at NYU film school, studying with the wonderful George Stoney, documentary filmmaker. And I thought I would make a short little film on my mother. And I started asking her questions. And she said that she did remember there were other children there. And at that time, in the mid-90s, there was very little published on the Kindertransports. She showed me Laurie Siegel's book, which is wonderful, Other People's Houses. And so I learned that my mother was one of these approximately 10,000 children. So that's how I learned about the Kindertransports. And I started asking people in New York, have you ever heard of the Kindertransports? And no one had. So I thought that this was a hidden story of the Holocaust that should be brought to light, to bring attention to this history that was unknown, that this legacy, and I include the second generation in my film, and also to encourage people to start asking questions in their own families, because it's not only Holocaust survivors who have secrets between the generations. And also, I thought it could inspire people to look at, here is, for all the complications and the things that worked and the things that didn't work and the things that could have been done better or differently, this was an operation, a rescue operation that saved the lives of many children. And it took people to act from far away, to say, yes, I'll give money. Yes, I'll work as a volunteer. Yes, I'll take a child into my home. And they did, and lives were saved. So 7 years later, because I was an unknown first-time filmmaker making a film about an unknown subject, I had a film that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, was shortlisted for Academy Award nomination, which if I knew what I was doing, I was in my 20s. It would have been nominated, but I didn't know you had to do a campaign. So it's still screened in classrooms and museums today, so many years later. And, when you make a film with or about a community of people, when they want you to be involved with them afterwards, you've done something right. You've made some good ethical choices. You haven't done everything wrong. But I can say I did not know that I would be still involved with the Kindertransports so many years later. It's been an honor. I've met so many amazing people of all generations. And that's what I have to say right now. And I will turn it over to Phyllis.
Having taught Holocaust literature and film for nearly 30 years at Northwestern University, and in covering so many tragic and compelling stories, one of them that reached out to me because I confess that an obstacle for me was that I really did not know any of the European languages in which survivors and victims wrote and spoke. But having studied British literature and culture for many, many years, I felt that was an entree for me that was legit. I knew English. And I discovered that there was a wealth of literature, of memoirs, poetry, fiction that had been written by various members of the Kindertransport. It all started in 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Kindertransport, when a woman named Bertha Leverton organized a reunion. And it was at that reunion, as the aging Kinder began to share stories with each other, that they realized that they had a compelling story to tell. They had hesitated until that point because they did not feel that it was legitimate for them to identify as survivors. After all, they had not experienced the camps. They had not experienced hiding in convents and in closets. They had not been on the run for 6 years. But as they revealed to each other, their stories were an integral part of Holocaust history. And so they began to write and began to speak. And it is from that reunion that we now have a wealth of testimony, oral and written, that tell us so much about this extraordinary experience. The experience, though, does not just rest on those stories. Rather, there are historical stories behind them that I think are very important to us. We usually don't think of the Kindertransport as an American story. After all, while Ilona and Melissa told us, there were other countries to which the Kinder traveled. But of course, Britain took in the largest amount, and that's where most of our stories come from. Very few made it to America. And the reason behind that, I think, is very compelling, much in the same way that the exhibit at the U.S. Holocaust Museum on America and the Holocaust has revealed all kinds of information that had either willfully or just accidentally been missing from the historical record. Well, the reason why there was no Kindertransport in American history is as compelling as the fact that there could have been. And the reasons stem from something that is very close to our own history today, having to do with American policies and attitudes towards immigration. A crucial moment occurred in January 1939 when a public opinion poll asked Americans if they would agree with a proposal to permit 10,000 refugee children from Germany and elsewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe to be brought into this country and taken care of in American homes. I'm going to read simply because I want to make sure I have the numbers straight. Only 26% of the respondents agreed with the idea. 67% opposed it. The next month, Democratic Senator Robert Wagner of New York and Republican Congresswoman Edith Rogers of Massachusetts sponsored a bipartisan bill in Congress that would allow 10,000 children, once again, the same number, under the age of 14 to enter the United States for 2 years. And the children would not be counted against the existing immigration quota. Well, the response is deafening. One Republican congressman said, "We cannot allow these people into our country. They will take American jobs." Mind you, the children were between the ages of 3 and 16. Another congressperson said it would be immoral to separate the children from their parents. No, they should die together. I mean, the attitudes, as deplorable as they sound, nonetheless, I think resonate very powerfully with us today. Now, the idea of the Kindertransport in Britain was to provide temporary refuge for the children. Assuming that, since there was no way to predict the progress of the war or its consequences, that at the end of the war, and nobody, of course, knew how long it would last, the children would be reunited with their parents and returned to Europe. So the idea that this would become a permanent home for the children was simply not on the drawing board. And what happened as a result is a very complicated stories. And I think one of the wondrous things about this exhibit, and I just walked through it yesterday, is that it offers a variety of experiences, voices, attitudes, perceptions, and responses to the experience, so that it does not allow us to see or view the Kindertransport experience as in any way homogeneous. It varied from situation to situation. For example, many homes, as we've already been told, were extremely welcoming, tried to integrate the children, tried to understand what it meant to take in a Jewish child when, for many Britons, they had never seen a Jew. They knew nothing about what it meant to be Jewish. And the children, especially the younger ones, were in no position, did not even have the language as they were learning English to express what Jewishness had meant in their own homes and communities. So it was a mutually foreign experience, alien, both for the children and for the host. Many host families tried very hard. Others didn't understand out of willful ignorance or just trying to get on with their own lives. We have to remember that this was wartime, that Britain was being bombed, children were being evacuated to the countryside, and so obviously survival is foremost on everyone's minds. Nonetheless, the children's experiences were very mixed, beginning with having landed at Dovercourt, Southampton, and then moved to these encampments in Dovercourt in the south of England. while some children already had sponsors who had identified them as, wanting to take them in, wanting to foster them, other children did not have sponsors. And one can only imagine, and this has been recorded in a wonderful memoir by the Kindertransport writer Karen Gershon, as sitting there in this humongous room waiting to be chosen. And as children were being picked up, identified, taken away, and the numbers in that hall diminished, looking around and feeling, is anybody going to pick me? And so this was, part of a series of traumatic events. And I want to assure you that the story is so complicated that one can neither impose a negative vision on the Kindertransport or just view it as a Pollyanna happily ever after situation. It was extremely complicated and extremely mixed. One example that I can give you is that when you think about the young ages of the children, we have to remember that among the challenges they experienced, in addition to exile and loss and adaptation to a new language, unfamiliar manners, unfamiliar styles of relating, and of course, not so trivial, adapting to different kinds of foods. So, for example, one of the kinder who has written about this said, "Can you imagine a Jewish child eating kippers for breakfast?" And of course, the host families, and given British rationing at the time, had a very sparse menu to offer, and a lot of it I don't think would be considered very appetizing to many of us. So this is minor, but it is an enormous part of the adjustment. Another adjustment had to do with British expectations, rules, and regulations regarding education. As was said, it was expected that the education was mandated till the age of 14. And for people in the working class, this was just a natural movement into starting a lifelong work in the trades or whatever. Well, so many of the kinder came from very cultured, highly educated homes where expectations for a child's education would be to simply go on, perhaps enter a profession like medicine, the law, and in a couple of cases, architecture. So when one kinder has recorded the experience having finished school and at the age of 14, going to an office to apply to continue her education. And she was asked, "And what is it that you intend to do?" And she answered, "I want to be a doctor." "No, no, no," the person on the other side of the desk said. "No, no. You must remember you are a refugee. So, consider going into domestic service. Consider being a teacher's aide, but do not consider becoming professional." On the flip side, to show you how complicated the experience was, one of the kinder recorded how her host family, understanding that she had had piano lessons as a child, said, "Oh, well, we have a piano. Why don't you play and we'll see about getting you lessons?" And then encouraged her, supported her at also when the age of 14 came around to attend a conservatory of music. And she went on to become a professional concert pianist. So the stories are so varied that we have to remember that the variation figures throughout the entire experience. including, by the way, on behalf of, from the perspective of the British Jewish communities. British Jews had never really entirely recovered from recurrences of anti-Semitism. And the most recent had been, and remember this is 1939, in 1936, Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, had, with his troops, marched through the Jewish East End of London. Well, what does this remind you of? Of course, it reminds you of one of the raison d'etres of this museum, the 1978 march of the neo-Nazis through Skokie. These memories remain searing in both the people who lived through it and their descendants. Those memories are passed along. And so the same thing was true with British Jewry, which was always on the cusp of feeling extreme anxiety about a resurgence of anti-Semitism. So to guard against that, the British Board of Deputies, the official Jewish council in Britain, had issued a pamphlet which it handed out to all refugees, including the Kinder. And the pamphlet was a list of do's and don'ts while you are in Britain, and that will encourage you to integrate into British culture. So among the do's and don'ts was don't ever complain. Don't ever compare what you're experiencing here with what you knew at home. And a kind of funny caveat to that is that the children, especially those who came from middle class and upper middle class homes in European cities, had had central heating in their apartments and homes, and they come to Britain where everything is ice cold. They were not allowed to ever complain about that. They couldn't complain about the food or any of the conditions. And as we've already heard, there were instances where children were expected to be cleaners in their foster homes and assume other kinds of tasks that they had never been asked to do in their parents' home. But once again, the story flips to how well so many of the Kinder prospered. They did struggle and manage to be educated. Many of them went into the professions and the arts. And there were Nobel Prize winners. So the story is a very complicated one, and one that I will leave you with is that while we tend to view the Kindertransport as a story that is separate from the Holocaust, there are a lot of connections in which we should need to integrate the Kindertransport into the story of the Holocaust. And among the ways that integration takes place is that there are, among the survivors, stories that are tragic, stories that are ones of courage and determination. And as with other Holocaust stories, there are absolutely marvelous memoirs, poetry, fiction, and as Melissa told us, documentary films and even feature films. So it's a story that all of us who are participating here are just so grateful that this museum has mounted this wonderful exhibit.
And now we have time for 3 questions. Does anyone have any questions for the panel?
Just 3.
Thank you. Do we know what percentage of Kinder were taken into Jewish homes in Great Britain?
So I'll answer that in sort of a general way about percentages. So The Kindertransports have not been studied very much until recently, in part because, as was noted, the Kinder themselves felt they were the lucky ones. Nothing really happened to them. It was their parents who really suffered. So, and they were building new lives in a new country, in new countries, without parents and grandparents around them. So, until really recently, the Kindertransports have not been properly studied. There are just now people going through archives, and Dr. Amy Williams is coming out with a new book in 2026 with Yale University Press. But there aren't really good answers to statistical questions just yet, as even when we talk about how many of the children saw their parents again. When I first made the film, people were saying, 80% never saw their parents again. Now the general consensus is around that 40% never saw their parents again. Some, saw one parent again, perhaps. But so, the British Jewish community was largely centered in London and was a lot of Russian Jews. So they didn't have the resources nor the desire to take these German Jews into their homes. So in many cases, the more established Jewish community gave money and helped with organizing the Kindertransports. And it was Jews and Quakers who petitioned Parliament. And you can read, if you're curious, you can read online what are called the Hansard hearings, which took place in November 1938, which led to the Kindertransports being approved. There was outreach to the Jewish community. My mother, for example, had correspondence class with a rabbi, which was more Jewish education than she ever had in Vienna. So, yeah. Just in one more thing. Not all of the Kindertransport children themselves were Jewish. And among those who were Jewish, certainly many were very assimilated. And that brings me to the other side of that is Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld, who brought in 1,000 Orthodox Jewish children on Kindertransport to London.
We should say, first, I'd like to express gratitude to Britain and other countries that were concerned about the lives of young children and try to save their lives. What I would like to know is what happened to very young children after the war who had nobody, and they were 14 but younger. They stay with families or put in orphanages, or what other options did they have?
So, unlike one of the main differences between the children who came out of Europe post-war was that the Kindertransport children were kept track of. So if they had any relatives at all, they tended to be reunited with them. There's a very early play called Kindertransport, which annoys me on so many levels. But one is it has the idea that a Kindertransport child would choose not to go with her parent who survived camps. And yes, I'm sure that did happen, but it was very rare. So most of them, from babies to adults, whose parent or parents survived, or even a distant relative, did reunite with them and did then make choices of where they would go. And some of them whose parents did not survive stayed with their foster family who then adopted them. There's one actually, a sort of interesting story of a brother and sister who were very young and whose parents did not survive and who were raised by a couple who was, I believe, Church of England, and sort of didn't really tell them that they were Jewish, which is a choice that foster and then adopted parents could make. But they became a nun and a priest. He just died recently. He was a priest all his life, and then was involved with Kindertransport, another association for Jewish refugee groups in England. They lived in England, and she was a nun with Sisters of Zion, which was a sort of Jewish friendly nun order. Anyway, jet lag. Please excuse me. Yes.
Just one addition to the children who were not Jewish. So these were children from families that had maybe converted, during the Nazi period or even earlier, and that or children that were considered non-Aryan, just as and a few politically, endangered cases. Yeah.
And one more question.
Thank you so much for this incredibly important panel. I really appreciate it. My mother, who's 97 and lives here, was put on a train in Vienna in 1938. But her parents had put an ad in the Jewish Chronicle on their own, so she wasn't really considered part of the Kindertransport. And I'm curious, do you consider all these other kids whose parents made that very difficult decision? We're going to send our daughter, Johanna, out of Vienna to live with an Orthodox family in Manchester. And they did it on their own. Her parents were murdered. She's still here and she's spoken here at the Holocaust Museum. So is she considered part of the Kindertransport or what?
So I'll answer that, and then others can answer that too. But in terms of the Kindertransport Association, when it was founded by Kinder who came to Britain. So they weren't even recognizing Kinder who were sent to Sweden or Switzerland, although we had very early members of the KTA who'd been sent to France and Sweden. I'm arguing, and the KTA's position is for a much more expansive view, that any unaccompanied child during that period, whether their parents smuggled them to the border of the Netherlands and then they went by themselves and joined an official Kindertransport. So I'm arguing that any unaccompanied child refugee during that time is part of a Kindertransport, whether they were on the official visa waiver scheme or not, if they were sent without their parents. And when I was in London, I went to see, I don't know if any of you know the artist Frank Auerbach, really wonderful painter, friends with Lucian Freud and so on. There's a beautiful exhibit of charcoal heads he did. And he also, his parents made a private arrangement to send him to England. And he's listed in many cases as a Kindertransport child, but and I don't know why, I'm really trying to find out why, he's saying he's not. But so I'm for expanding it. And yes, your mother was on a Kindertransport, and I invite you and your mother and any other Kindertransport families to join the Kindertransport Association.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, Melissa, and Ilona. You feel free to go over and visit the exhibition if you have not seen it. I still have a lot of cookies you can finish. So thank you so much for coming today, and thank you to our panel.